winter wind howled against the mullioned windows of Ashford Manor like a creature seeking entry, its mournful cry echoing through corridors that stretched into darkness, and in the Duchess's chamber, a room of cream silk and gilded mirrors that reflected candlelight in trembling pools of gold. Lady Celeste Blackwood sat perfectly still upon the edge of an enormous four-poster bed in her wedding gown, a cascade of ivory satin and Belgian lace that pooled around her like sea foam, delicate and somehow tragic in its beauty. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows that danced across walls, hung with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to watch her with something between pity and accusation. She had been waiting for 3 hours. Her lady's maid had departed after the second hour, dismissed with a gentle word and a smile that Celeste had forced past the tightening in her throat, for she could not allow the servants to witness her humiliation, though she suspected they already knew. Had perhaps always known what manner of man the Duke of Ashford truly was. Her hands lay folded in her lap, pale against the white of her gown, and she studied them as though they belonged to a stranger. These hands that had signed the marriage contract that morning, that had accepted his ring, that had trembled when he'd kissed them with lips as cold as marble during the ceremony in the chapel, where 200 guests had witnessed her become the Duchess of Ashford. He had been beautiful in his severity, tall and dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter storms, a face carved in aristocratic lines that revealed nothing, gave nothing, promised nothing. She had expected formality. Arranged marriages among the nobility were contracts of property and bloodlines, not affection, and she had steeled herself for a union built on duty rather than devotion. But she had not expected cruelty. She had not expected abandonment. The note lay beside her on the counterpane, crisp vellum bearing his family crest, and a single line written in slashing black script. "I shall be abroad on business. The estate is yours to manage as you see fit." No explanation, no apology, no indication of when or if he would return. He had left immediately after the wedding breakfast, departing in his carriage while guests still celebrated in the ballroom below, and she had discovered his absence only when she'd been brought to this chamber and told that his Grace had urgent matters requiring his immediate attention. Celeste felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure opening in the careful composure she had maintained throughout her life as the daughter of an earl, raised to be gracious and dignified, and above all things, restrained. She would not cry. She would not give him that power over her, though her eyes burned with the effort of holding back tears and her throat ached with swallowed grief. Outside, the wind continued its assault upon the ancient stones of Ashford Manor, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of the house, a clock struck midnight, each chime falling like a hammer blow against her heart, marking the end of her wedding day and the beginning of a loneliness she had never imagined possible. Weeks passed in the sprawling emptiness of Ashford Manor, each day a careful performance of dignity enacted before servants who moved through the corridors with pitying eyes and hushed voices that fell silent whenever she appeared, and Celeste discovered that loneliness in a house filled with people was perhaps the cruelest form of solitude. She rose each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, dressed in the elegant gowns befitting a Duchess silk mourning, dresses in shades of dove grey and pale blue that seemed to echo her melancholy, and took her breakfast alone in the vast dining room, where the table could seat 30 but held only her single place setting at one end, a small island of china and silver in an ocean of polished mahogany. She walked the grounds when weather permitted, her footsteps echoing through formal gardens where winter roses bloomed in defiant beauty, their petals pale against thorned stems, and she found herself drawn to the wilder edges of the estate, where overgrown paths led to abandoned follies and forgotten grottos, places that matched the desolation in her heart. The estate itself was magnificent in its melancholy, a sprawling Gothic revival manor set among ancient oaks and rolling parkland, its grey stone facade adorned with gargoyles and intricate carvings that seemed to judge all who passed beneath them, and she spent hours in the portrait gallery studying the faces of Ashford ancestors, searching for some clue to her husband's nature in the stern countenances of his forebears. She tried to understand his cruelty, turned it over in her mind like a puzzle she might solve if only she examined it from the correct angle. Though no answer came, only the echo of that single devastating note and the memory of his cold eyes that had looked through her rather than at her during their wedding ceremony. She had expected an arranged marriage to be loveless, had prepared herself for formality and distance and the sort of polite partnership her own parents had maintained. But she had not anticipated this absolute rejection, this complete negation of her existence, as though he had married a ghost rather than a woman. Her pride would not allow her to return to her family's estate, to arrive at her father's door like a defeated child seeking comfort, for what could she tell them that would not increase their shame, that the Duke of Ashford, one of England's most powerful peers, had found her so lacking that he could not bear even a single night in her presence. The servants whispered, of course, though they attempted discretion, and she caught fragments of speculation in darkened hallways that His Grace had a mistress abroad, and that the marriage had been made under duress, that there was some dark secret in the Ashford bloodline that prevented normal marital relations, and each whispered theory cut like glass. Though she maintained her composure, smiled graciously, issued household instructions with calm authority, played the role of duchess while feeling like an impostor in borrowed clothes. At night, alone in her chamber, she sometimes stood before the window overlooking the moonlit grounds and wondered what she had done to deserve this peculiar punishment, this marriage that was somehow worse than no marriage at all, and the estate stretched before her like a beautiful prison, its melancholic grandeur a mirror to the desolation blooming inside her chest. 6 weeks after her abandonment, Celeste forced herself to attend Lady Pemberton's spring assembly, arriving at the grand London townhouse in a gown of pale lavender silk that made her feel like a wraith drifting through rooms filled with laughter and music, and the glittering social world that suddenly seemed foreign after her isolation at Ashford Manor, and she endured the pitying glances and hushed whispers with her head held high, smiling graciously even as she felt herself fracturing beneath the weight of so many curious eyes. She stood near the refreshment table, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand, preparing to make her excuses and retreat to the safety of her empty estate, when a voice beside her said with genuine warmth, "Your Grace, I must confess that lavender suits you far better than the rather severe painting of you I saw in the portrait gallery at Ashford, though I suppose no artist could truly capture the particular shade of resilience in your eyes." She turned to find Lord Nathaniel Hartley bowing over her hand, his touch gentle and brief, his manner so unlike the cold formality she had come to associate with aristocratic men that she felt something inside her chest shift unexpectedly, like ice beginning to thaw. He was handsome in an approachable way, with warm brown eyes that held actual kindness rather than calculation, auburn hair that fell in slightly disheveled waves, suggesting he cared more for substance than appearance, and a smile that reached his eyes when he looked at her, as though she were a person rather than a title or a piece in society's elaborate chess game. "You knew my husband well enough to visit Ashford's portrait gallery?" she asked carefully, aware that Lord Hartley was known throughout London as the Duke's greatest rival in matters of politics and business, and their families locked in a generations-old competition that everyone whispered about but no one fully understood. "I knew him at Cambridge," Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying an undercurrent of something complicated, neither hatred nor friendship, but something more nuanced. "We were both reading philosophy, though we rarely agreed on anything, and I found his jazz collection of Flemish masters far more agreeable than his company, no offense to your marriage. Of course." His honesty surprised a genuine laugh from her, the first she had uttered in weeks, and the sound felt strange in her throat, rusty from disuse. "None taken, my lord, as my husband has made it abundantly clear that my company holds little appeal for him." The words escaped before she could stop them, a flash of bitter truth that she immediately regretted, but Nathaniel's expression shifted to one of such genuine concern that she felt tears threaten for the first time since that terrible wedding night. "Then your husband is a greater fool than even I credited him for being," he said quietly, and there was no mockery in his tone, no attempt at seduction, only a simple statement of fact, delivered with such sincerity that Celeste felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, the tentative possibility of friendship, of being seen and valued by someone when she had begun to believe herself invisible. They spoke for an hour in that corner of the ballroom, discussing literature and travel and the ridiculous fashions of the season, and when he requested permission to call upon her at Ashford Manor, she found herself agreeing despite the whispers she could already hear swirling around them, because for the first time since becoming the Duchess of Ashford, she felt like Celeste again, like a person whose thoughts and opinions mattered to someone, and she clung to that feeling like a drowning woman grasping at driftwood in a storm-tossed sea. Months passed in a peculiar dance of propriety and growing intimacy, as Lord Nathaniel Hartley became a regular presence at Ashford Manor, arriving each week with various pretenses: a book he thought she might enjoy, news of mutual acquaintances in London, questions about the estate's renowned rose gardens that he claimed to wish to replicate at his own property. And Celeste found herself anticipating his visits with an eagerness that both comforted and troubled her in equal measure. They walked the winter gardens together as frost transformed the landscape into something ethereal and strange, their breath visible in the cold air as they discussed poetry and politics and the absurdities of social convention, and she discovered that he possessed a mind as sharp as any she had encountered, unafraid to challenge her opinions while respecting her intelligence in a way that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of men who expected her to simply smile and agree. He noticed details that others overlooked: the way she favored her left hand when arranging flowers, her preference for walking the eastern path where morning light filtered through the bare branches, the slight tension that appeared in her shoulders whenever someone mentioned the Duke. And these small observations made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced, as though he were carefully sketching her portrait in his mind, capturing nuances that even she had not recognized in herself. She told him things she had never voiced aloud, about her childhood dreams of traveling to Italy to see the great Renaissance paintings, her secret pleasure in Gothic novels that society deemed inappropriate for ladies, her frustration with the endless performance required of her position, and he listened with complete attention, never dismissing or diminishing her thoughts, responding with his own vulnerabilities about the weight of family expectations and the loneliness of holding unpopular political views in a world that valued conformity above conscience. Their conversations revealed depths in both their characters, her resilience beneath the veneer of wounded pride, his idealism tempered by genuine compassion rather than naive optimism, and she found herself laughing again, genuine laughter that rose from her chest unbidden, particularly when he mimicked the pompous Lord Wetherby's theatrical speeches in Parliament or recounted absurd stories from his travels on the continent. Yet always there was the shadow of her absent husband, the weight of vows spoken before God and witnesses, and she felt herself caught between two impossible positions: loyalty to a man who had abandoned her without explanation, and the warmth of a present companion who made her feel alive for the first time since her wedding night. Nathaniel brought her small gifts with each visit, never anything that could be construed as inappropriate, but tokens that showed he understood her: a first edition of a novel she had mentioned, loving, sheet music for a melancholy sonata she had heard once and mourned never finding again, a watercolor sketch of the estate's gardens that captured their wild beauty, and each gesture carved deeper into the defenses she had built around her heart. She tried to maintain distance, reminded herself constantly of propriety and duty and the sanctity of marriage vows, but she felt herself thawing from the isolation that had frozen her since becoming the Duchess of Ashford, like spring gradually overtaking winter's grip, and she could not determine whether this thawing was salvation or the beginning of an even more profound devastation. As autumn arrived and painted the estate in shades of amber and crimson, Celeste found herself standing at a precipice she had not intended to approach, the friendship with Lord Nathaniel Hartley having evolved into something far more dangerous than pleasant companionship, and she knew it. The evening he arrived with a leather-bound first edition of Dante's Inferno, knowing somehow that she had been searching for this particular translation for years, and when their fingers brushed as he handed her the volume, she felt an electric current run through her body that had nothing to do with simple gratitude and everything to do with the way he looked at her as though she were the only woman in England whose happiness mattered. Their evenings in the library became a ritual she both craved and feared, the two of them seated in wing-back chairs before the fire, discussing philosophy and literature with an intensity that felt more intimate than any physical touch, and she discovered that he challenged her intellectually in ways she had never experienced, arguing passionately about Rousseau's theories of natural man or debating the merits of Gothic versus Romantic poetry, his face animated with genuine enthusiasm when she countered his points with her own carefully constructed arguments. He brought her sheet music for melancholy sonatas that matched the ache in her chest, pieces by Chopin and Schumann that seemed composed specifically for lonely autumn evenings, and sometimes she would play while he sat listening, and the music became a conversation between them, more honest than words, expressing longings neither dared voice aloud. She found herself laughing at his dry observations about society's absurdities, genuine laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, and she caught herself thinking about him during the long hours when he was absent, wondering what book he was reading, or whether he had noticed the same spectacular sunset that had painted her solitary dinner in shades of orange and gold. Yet with each moment of joy came an equal measure of guilt, the weight of her wedding ring heavy on her finger as she smiled at another man's jokes, the echo of vows spoken in a cold church haunting her when she found herself anticipating Nathaniel's visits with an eagerness that felt like betrayal. She tried to maintain proper distance, insisted their meetings occur only in public rooms with servants present, never allowed herself to be alone with him in any situation that could be misconstrued, but emotional intimacy, she discovered, required no physical proximity to feel like infidelity, and she was building with him something her absent husband had never attempted to create. Her internal struggle became a constant companion, the voice of duty warring with the whisper of longing, and she would lie awake nights telling herself that friendship was not betrayal, that conversation and shared laughter did not violate her marriage vows, but her heart knew she was splitting hairs, passing definitions to justify the undeniable truth that she was falling in love with Lord Nathaniel Hartley, while still bound by law and sacrament to a man who had abandoned her without explanation or mercy, and the knowledge that she stood on dangerous ground did nothing to stop her from taking one step closer to the edge each time. Nathaniel smiled at her as though she were worth cherishing. The whispers that had begun as speculation crystallized into open scandal as the London season progressed, and Celeste felt the weight of society's judgment, like a physical force pressing against her chest whenever she entered a ballroom. The conversations that stopped abruptly at her approach, the fans that rose to hide moving lips, the eyes that followed her with expressions ranging from pity to condemnation, and she understood with bitter clarity that the Ton had decided she was no longer simply the abandoned Duchess, but rather the fallen woman who had taken her husband's rival as a lover, regardless of the truth that nothing improper had occurred between herself and Lord Nathaniel beyond conversation and companionship. At Lady Pemberton's musicale, she endured pointed stares as Nathaniel sat beside her during a particularly moving performance of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and though they maintained proper distance and spoke only of the music, she could feel the room's collective disapproval radiating toward them like heat from a fire. She could see in her peripheral vision the dowagers leaning together to share their censure, could hear in the sudden silence when she approached refreshments the verdict society had already rendered without benefit of trial or evidence. She defended their friendship when her sister-in-law visited with thinly veiled concerns, insisting with perhaps too much vehemence that Lord Hartley was merely a kind acquaintance who had shown her courtesy during her husband's absence, that nothing untoward had transpired, that she remained faithful to her marriage vows despite the Duke's abandonment. But even as she spoke the words, she questioned whether emotional infidelity was not its own form of betrayal, whether the fact that she dreamed of Nathaniel's smile and longed for his company and felt her heart lift at the sound of his voice in the entrance hall did not constitute a violation of the promises she had made before God. The strain of maintaining appearances while her internal world crumbled became exhausting. Each social engagement, a performance that required her to hold her head high while drowning in shame and confusion, to smile graciously while her reputation disintegrated around her, to pretend indifference to whispers that grew louder with each passing week. The confrontation came at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball, when Lady Thornbury, a woman known for her cutting tongue and delight in others' misfortunes, approached Celeste in the retiring room, where she had sought momentary refuge from the stares and speculation, and with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, said in a voice loud enough for the other women present to hear, "How remarkable that you managed to appear in public at all, Your Grace, given the circumstances of your domestic situation, or should I say, your situation with Lord Hartley, since your husband seems to have quite disappeared from the narrative." The words struck like a slap, and Celeste felt her face flush with humiliation and rage, felt every eye in the room upon her, waiting to see whether she would crumble or fight, and she drew herself to her full height, channeling every ounce of aristocratic dignity her breeding had instilled, and replied with ice in her voice. "I was unaware that friendship between members of society had become scandalous, Lady Thornbury, though I suppose those with impoverished inner lives must create drama where none exists to fill their empty hours." And though the response earned her a ripple of shocked gasps and Lady Thornbury's mottled fury, Celeste left the room knowing that she had won the battle but was losing the war, that society had already condemned her regardless of her innocence, and that the friendship with Nathaniel that had been her salvation was becoming the instrument of her complete social destruction. The evening arrived wrapped in November fog, thick and oppressive as it pressed against the library windows, and Celeste sat before the fire watching shadows dance across the Persian carpet while waiting for Nathaniel's arrival, knowing with a certainty that felt like doom that something must change, that they had reached a precipice from which there could be no retreat without consequence. And when he entered the room, his face held an expression she had never seen before, something desperate and determined that made her heart contract with equal parts hope and dread. They attempted their usual ritual of polite conversation about the books he had brought, a volume of Keats and another of Shelley, but the words felt hollow against the weight of unspoken truth hanging between them, and finally he set down his teacup with trembling hands and said, "Celeste, I cannot continue this pretense." And she felt the room tilt as though the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet, knowing that once certain words were spoken they could never be unheard, that they stood at the threshold of irrevocable change. He moved to kneel before her chair, propriety abandoned, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult, and he began to speak in a voice raw with emotion, telling her that he had tried to remain merely her friend, had fought against his feelings with every rational argument he possessed, but that he could no longer deny that he had fallen desperately, completely in love with her, that every moment spent in her company was both ecstasy and agony, that watching her suffer her husband's neglect while being unable to offer more than companionship was slowly destroying him, and the words poured from him like a dam breaking, releasing months of carefully restrained passion. Celeste felt tears streaming down her face as she listened, her own heart cracking open to release the truth she had been denying even to herself, and she heard herself confessing in a broken whisper how the Duke had abandoned her on their wedding night without explanation or mercy, how she had waited in her bridal chamber for hours like a fool, how the note he left had contained nothing but cold instruction to remain at the estate until his return, how the humiliation and loneliness had nearly destroyed her until Nathaniel's kindness had given her reason to feel human again. And as she spoke, the words she had never voiced to anyone, the pain of that abandonment fresh and devastating as the night it occurred, she felt Nathaniel's hands reach for hers with a tenderness that made her ache with longing. For one suspended moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, their faces inches apart, his hands holding hers as though she were something precious and fragile, and she could feel the pull between them like gravity, could see in his eyes that he wanted to kiss her, could feel her own body leaning toward him in surrender, and she understood with terrible clarity that she wanted him to, wanted to feel cherished and desired, wanted to know what it meant to be truly wanted by a man who saw her as more than a contractual obligation. Yet even as the impulse rose within her, another voice spoke with equal force, the voice of honor and vows and the woman she had been raised to be, and she pulled back with a sob that was half despair and half relief, saying, "We cannot, Nathaniel, no matter how much we might wish it, no matter how cruel my husband has been, I am still his wife, still bound by vows I spoke before God, and I cannot betray those promises, even if he has betrayed me in every way that matters." And she watched his face crumble with understanding and resignation, watched him release her hands and rise to his feet. She watched him turn away to compose himself before the fire. The silence that followed held all the weight of impossible love and necessary renunciation, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, saying that he understood, that he honored her integrity even as it broke his heart, that he would withdraw from her life because his presence had become a torment to them both, and she wanted to protest, wanted to beg him to stay, but she knew he was right, knew that they had reached the end of what their friendship could be, without crossing into territory that would destroy her last shreds of self-respect. And so she nodded through her tears and let him go, watching him walk out of the library and out of her life, leaving her alone once more with nothing but the fire's dying light and the devastating knowledge that she had just sent away the only person who had made her feel alive in nearly a year of exile in her own marriage. 3 days after Nathaniel's departure, Celeste stood in the morning room, arranging hothouse roses with hands that still trembled when she thought of what she had lost, when the butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality and announced that His Grace the Duke of Ashford had returned and was currently in his study, and the crystal vase slipped from her fingers to shatter against the marble floor, sending water and petals cascading across her slippers, though she barely registered the mess, as shock and fury warred within her chest at the audacity of his return. Now, after nearly a year of silence and abandonment, after she had finally begun to piece together some semblance of existence in his absence, she found him standing before the fire in the study that had remained locked since his departure, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his traveling coat, his dark hair slightly longer than fashion dictated, and when he turned to face her, his expression held none of the cold indifference she remembered from their wedding day, but rather something that looked almost like anguish, before his features shuttered into aristocratic neutrality, and he offered a slight bow that seemed to mock the intimacy that should have existed between husband and wife. Their initial exchange consisted of brittle pleasantries that barely concealed the chasm between them, his inquiries about her health and the estate's management answered with icy politeness that gave no hint of the devastation his absence had wrought, and she observed with bitter satisfaction the tension that crept into his jaw when she mentioned that Lord Hartley had been kind enough to provide company during the long months of her isolation, watched something dark and dangerous flash in his eyes at the casual mention of his rival's name. The dinner that evening proved excruciating beyond measure, for the Duke had insisted that Lord Hartley be invited, as he had apparently called earlier that day, unaware of the Duke's return, and Celeste found herself seated between the two men in the cavernous dining room, where every clink of silver against china seemed to echo like thunder, where the Duke's cold gaze moved between her and Nathaniel with an assessment that felt like accusation, where Nathaniel's careful courtesy toward her seemed suddenly weighted with meaning under her husband's scrutiny. She watched the Duke observe how Nathaniel knew without asking that she preferred wine to ratafia, how he referenced conversations they had shared about poetry and philosophy, how his smile toward her held a warmth and familiarity that spoke of intimacy, even if their friendship had remained technically proper, and she could see her husband's fingers tightening around his wine glass until she feared the crystal might shatter, could see the muscle jumping in his jaw as he maintained rigid civility while clearly cataloguing every gesture and glance that passed between his wife and the man who had been her sole comfort during his absence. Celeste felt caught in a vice of impossible emotions, rage at her husband for abandoning her and then returning with what appeared to be jealous outrage, guilt over the depth of feeling she had developed for Nathaniel, even though nothing improper had occurred, and a strange, unbidden awareness of her husband as a man rather than merely the cold stranger who had left her alone on their wedding night, and she understood with sinking certainty that everything was about to become infinitely more complicated than the simple loneliness she had learned to survive. The confrontation came the morning after that terrible dinner, when Lord Hartley had barely departed and the household still thrummed with uncomfortable tension, and the Duke summoned Celeste to his study with all the imperious authority of a man who had never questioned his right to command, though she entered the room with her spine rigid and her chin lifted in defiance, determined not to be cowed by the husband who had forfeited any claim to her obedience through his abandonment. He stood before the windows overlooking the frost-covered gardens, his silhouette dark against the pale morning light, and when he turned to face her, his expression held such cold fury that she felt her breath catch despite her resolve to remain unmoved, and he spoke in a voice like ice shattering, demanding to know the nature of her relationship with Lord Hartley, whether she had made him a cuckolded fool, whether the servant's whispers he had already heard were founded in truth or mere speculation, and each word struck like a physical blow, even as rage began to build within her chest at his audacity. She felt something break inside her then, the careful control she had maintained for nearly a year, fracturing under the weight of injustice too great to be borne in silence, and she heard herself speaking in a voice that shook with fury and pain, telling him that he had abandoned her on their wedding night without explanation or mercy. that he had left her alone in a strange house among strange servants, while society whispered about the unwanted bride, that Lord Hartley had been the only person to show her basic human kindness in the endless months of isolation he had imposed upon her, and she watched his face change as she spoke, watched something like shock replace the accusatory anger, but she could not stop the words that had been dammed up for too long. She told him that while her friendship with Nathaniel had been improper only in the eyes of those determined to see scandal, it was also the sole thing that had kept her from complete despair, and that she had done nothing to be ashamed of, though God knew she had been tempted, that if he sought to cast blame for any impropriety, he might look first to his own cruelty in abandoning a bride who had come to him innocent and hopeful, despite the arrangement that had forced their union, and she saw him flinch as though she had struck him, saw his hands clench at his sides as he struggled with some internal battle she could not comprehend. The Duke's response came in a voice stripped of its earlier coldness, replaced by something raw and almost anguished, and he said that he had not abandoned her out of cruelty, but rather out of a terrible misunderstanding, that he had believed on their wedding day that she was in love with another man, that he had seen her weeping before the ceremony, and heard her whisper to her companion about loving someone she could never have, that he had thought himself shackled to a woman who would despise him forever for preventing her happiness, and that he had left to spare them both the agony of living together under such circumstances. And Celeste stared at him in dawning horror as she realized he spoke of her childhood friend Margaret, to whom she had been confiding her fears about the arranged marriage itself, not about any lost love. The silence that descended upon them held the weight of wasted months and mutual suffering born from assumptions never questioned, and Celeste felt tears streaming down her face as she recognized the tragic absurdity of their situation, how they had both been wounded by pride and miscommunication, how easily everything might have been different if either had possessed the courage to speak plainly. And she saw her own anguish reflected in her husband's eyes as he too understood what they had lost, though the chasm between them felt too wide to bridge, the damage too deep to heal through simple explanation. Into this terrible moment of revelation came a knock at the door, and Lord Hartley entered with a dignity that seemed to fill the room, and he spoke directly to the Duke, saying that he had come to make clear that the Duchess had behaved with nothing but complete propriety throughout their acquaintance, that if anyone's honor had been compromised, it was his own for allowing his feelings to grow beyond what friendship should permit, that he was removing himself from their lives permanently so that they might have opportunity to build the marriage they should have had from the beginning. And with a final bow to Celeste that held both farewell and blessing, he departed, leaving husband and wife alone with the wreckage of their misunderstandings and no clear path toward reconciliation. The days following Nathaniel's departure passed in a haze of careful politeness between Celeste and her husband, each circling the other like wounded animals, uncertain whether to flee or attack, and she found herself retreating to the library, where she had spent so many companionable hours with Nathaniel, seeking solace among the leather-bound volumes that had witnessed her brief happiness, when she discovered tucked between the pages of a poetry collection a sealed letter addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand, and upon opening it she found a brief note from the Duke's confidant, Mr. Pemberton, asking her to meet him in the estate's winter garden that afternoon regarding matters of utmost importance concerning her husband's conduct. She went with trepidation, tightening her chest, uncertain what new revelation could possibly make their situation more complicated, and found the elderly gentleman waiting beneath the bare branches of an oak tree, his weathered face creased with concern and something that looked almost like relief at her appearance, and he began without preamble to speak of things he said he had been sworn to secrecy about, but could no longer keep silent, for he had watched two good people destroy themselves through tragic misunderstanding, and what he revealed made Celeste's heart constrict with a pain more acute than anything she had yet experienced. Mr. Pemberton explained that the Duke had not merely believed Celeste loved another, but had himself been desperately, hopelessly in love with her from the moment their betrothal was announced, that he had studied her portrait for hours in the weeks before their wedding, had interrogated mutual acquaintances about her interests and character, and had arranged the estate's renovations specifically to accommodate preferences he had learned were hers, and that on their wedding day, when he had seen her tears and heard her whispered words about impossible love, something in him had shattered completely, for he had convinced himself that forcing her into intimacy with a man she could never love would be the deepest cruelty he could inflict. The confidant produced a bundle of letters the Duke had written but never sent during his year abroad. Letters filled with longing and self-recrimination, with detailed descriptions of places he wished he could show her. With admissions of love so raw and vulnerable that Celeste felt tears streaming down her face as she read them, and she understood with devastating clarity that her husband had been suffering as much as she had, that his departure had been an act of what he believed was selfless sacrifice rather than cold abandonment, that he had spent every day of their separation in his own private agony, believing he had trapped her in a marriage to a man she despised. Mr. Pemberton explained that the Duke had returned only because he could no longer bear the separation, despite believing she would never welcome his presence, that he had learned of Lord Hartley's attentions and had been consumed with jealous anguish, even while telling himself that he should be glad she had found happiness however she could find it, and that the confrontation in the study had been born from wounded pride and desperate love rather than from any genuine belief in her impropriety, for he knew her character too well to truly doubt her honor. Celeste sat in the winter garden long after Mr. Pemberton departed, holding those unsent letters against her heart, understanding finally the full scope of the tragedy they had enacted, how two people who might have found happiness together had instead inflicted mutual torture through assumptions and pride and the inability to speak simple truths, and she felt the weight of wasted months pressing upon her, even as something new stirred in her chest, something that felt almost like hope, for if her husband had loved her all along, if his cruelty had been misguided protection rather than indifference, then perhaps the foundation for a true marriage existed after all. Perhaps the months with Nathaniel had not been the only possibility for happiness, and she rose from the bench, with resolution crystallizing in her mind, uncertain what the future held, but determined finally to fight for the marriage that should have been theirs from the beginning. The note arrived at Celeste's chamber the following morning, delivered by a footman who would not meet her eyes, and Lord Nathaniel Hartley's elegant script requested a private audience in the east drawing-room before his final departure from the county, and she stood holding the cream-colored paper with trembling fingers, knowing that this meeting would demand a choice she was not certain she was prepared to make, for the revelations about her husband's hidden love had shaken the foundations of everything she believed about her situation, even as the months of genuine companionship with Nathaniel had created bonds not easily severed by simple understanding of past mistakes. She dressed with unusual care, though she could not have said whether she sought to honor Nathaniel's regard or to armor herself against the vulnerability of this farewell, and when she entered the drawing-room where pale winter sunlight filtered through tall windows, she found him standing before the fireplace, much as her husband had stood in his study during their confrontation, but where the Duke had radiated cold fury, Nathaniel's posture spoke only of resignation and a sorrow that made her heart constrict with answering pain. He turned at her entrance, and the expression on his face held such naked longing that she nearly fled the room, but he gestured to the settee with perfect courtesy and waited until she was seated before speaking, in a voice rough with suppressed emotion, telling her that he had come to say what honor had prevented him from saying before, that he loved her with a devotion that had taken him entirely by surprise, that in another life, another circumstance, he would have courted her properly and hoped to win her heart through patience and genuine regard, and that even now, despite everything, he could not let her go without offering her an escape from a marriage that had brought her such suffering, for he had the means to take her away, to provide her with safety and comfort, far from the society that had whispered about her abandonment. Celeste listened with tears streaming silently down her face, understanding that Nathaniel offered her everything she had believed she wanted during those long months of isolation, the warmth and companionship and gentle affection that her husband had denied her. And yet even as he spoke, she found herself thinking of those unsent letters, of her husband's year of self-imposed exile, believing he was freeing her to find happiness, of the love that had existed all along beneath the surface of cruel misunderstanding, and she recognized with startling clarity that while Nathaniel had saved her from despair, he had done so by being present when her husband was not, by filling a void rather than by being irreplaceable himself. She spoke carefully, choosing words that would honor his genuine feeling while being truthful about her own heart, telling him that she would be forever grateful for his kindness when she had no one else, that his friendship had been a precious gift in her darkest time, but that she had never truly known her husband, had never been given the opportunity to discover what they might become together, and that the revelations of the past days had shown her that her marriage deserved at least the chance to become what it should have been from the beginning, even if that chance led ultimately to more heartbreak. She saw the pain in Nathaniel's eyes even as he nodded with understanding, and he crossed the room to take her hand in his, pressing a final kiss to her fingers with a tenderness that made her weep openly, and he told her that he hoped the Duke would prove worthy of the choice she was making, that she deserved every happiness, and that he would carry the memory of their friendship as a treasure, even as he released any claim to more. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the drawing room with her decision made, and her future uncertain but entirely in her own hands. The first dinner they shared after Nathaniel's departure stretched across an eternity of awkward silences, punctuated by the clink of silver against china, and Celeste sat at one end of the mahogany table that could seat 30, while her husband occupied the other end. The vast expanse between them, a physical manifestation of the chasm in their understanding, and she watched him covertly as he struggled to find words that seemed to stick in his throat, his jaw working with tension, as he began some observation about the weather, only to trail off into silence when she offered nothing but a brief acknowledgement. And she recognized her own culpability in the stilted exchange, even as her wounded pride and lingering hurt made warmth impossible. For knowing that he had loved her from afar did not erase the months of abandonment, did not unmake the humiliation of being left alone on her wedding night, did not heal the damage wrought by his inability to speak simple truths. He attempted conversation again the following evening, asking about her preferences for the spring gardens, and this time she forced herself to answer with more than monosyllables, describing the roses her mother had grown at Blackwood Manor, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been hope or pain or both, and he replied that he had already instructed the gardeners to plant that very variety, that he had learned of her fondness for them before their wedding, and the revelation that he had been paying such attention even then, while maintaining his cold exterior, made her throat tighten with complicated emotion. The household seemed to hold its collective breath during those early weeks, servants moving through their duties with unusual quiet, as though afraid any sound might shatter the fragile attempts at civility, and Mrs. Hensworth, the housekeeper, wore an expression of cautious optimism whenever she encountered Celeste, clearly hoping that the Duke's return might herald some improvement in her mistress's circumstances, though she was too well trained to voice such hopes aloud. And Celeste found herself wondering what the staff made of this strange marriage, whether they pitied her or judged her, or simply accepted the incomprehensible ways of the nobility. She observed her husband during these stilted meals and brief encounters in the drawing room, noting the way his fingers would drum against his thigh when he seemed to be gathering courage to speak, the tension in his shoulders when she answered him with coolness, the flash of something raw in his eyes when she mentioned some book or piece of music, and he realized how little he actually knew of her despite his year of longing from afar, and she understood that he was as lost in this situation as she was, as uncertain how to bridge the gap between them, and the parallel nature of their struggle should have made connection easier, but somehow only emphasized the tragedy of their mutual inability to reach across the distance. Her own thoughts circled endlessly during the long nights when sleep eluded her, replaying those unsent letters against the memory of his abandonment, weighing the love he claimed to have felt against the pain he had inflicted, trying to reconcile the man who had studied her portrait for hours with the man who had left her weeping in her wedding gown, and she recognized that forgiveness would not come easily or quickly, that trust once shattered required painstaking reconstruction. But she also understood that if she did not make some effort toward him, they would remain frozen in this terrible politeness until one or both of them broke under the strain of proximity without connection. The storm arrived without warning on a late February afternoon, when the sky darkened to pewter and wind howled through the chimneys of Ashford Estate, and Celeste had retreated to the library, seeking solace in books as she so often did during these difficult weeks, settling into the window seat with a volume of poetry she could not seem to concentrate upon, and she did not hear her husband enter until thunder cracked so violently that she startled and looked up to find him standing near the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher in the strange greenish light that preceded the deluge. He asked if she minded his presence with such careful formality that it hurt something in her chest. And she gestured to the chair near the fire in silent permission, returning her gaze to the page, though she absorbed nothing of the words, too aware of him settling into the leather wingback, of the sound of rain beginning to lash against the windows, of the peculiar intimacy of being trapped together by the weather's violence when they had been so studiously avoiding prolonged proximity. They sat in silence for perhaps half an hour, the only sounds the crackling fire and the storm's fury, and gradually Celeste felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, for there was something almost peaceful in this shared quiet. No expectation of conversation to navigate or stilted pleasantries to exchange. Just two people sheltering from the tempest, and when she glanced up from her book, she found him staring into the flames with such profound sorrow on his unguarded face that she felt her anger waver for the first time since his return. He must have sensed her regard, because he turned toward her and their eyes met across the shadowed room, and he spoke then in a voice barely audible above the storm, telling her that he knew she had every right to despise him, that his actions had been unforgivable regardless of his intentions, but that he needed her to understand that he had never meant to cause her such pain, that his own upbringing had taught him nothing of how marriages could be, except what he had witnessed in his parents' cold arrangement, where his mother had wept quietly for years over his father's indifference, and his father had retreated into icy formality to avoid the messiness of emotion. She set down her book and listened as he continued with halting words, explaining that he had watched his mother waste away, loving a man who could not love her back, had vowed never to trap a woman in such suffering, and when he had believed she loved another, he had thought himself noble in leaving her free, rather than forcing her to endure a husband's unwanted attentions. And she heard in his voice the echo of old wounds, of a child who had learned that love brought only anguish, of a man who had convinced himself that absence was kindness. The vulnerability in his confession cracked something open in Celeste's carefully maintained defenses, and she found herself speaking for the first time, not from anger, but from a tentative desire to understand, asking him how he could have believed she loved another when she had barely known him before their wedding. And he admitted that he had seen her laughing with her childhood friend at the betrothal announcement, had witnessed an easy affection between them that he had never known how to inspire, and had convinced himself in his fear and inadequacy that she had been forced to accept his suit, and she recognized in that moment that they had both been prisoners of assumptions, both too proud or too frightened to speak simple truths that might have saved them months of suffering. And while her anger did not vanish, it became something more complex, tempered by this glimpse of the wounded man beneath the cold duke. And when lightning illuminated the library, she saw in his eyes, not the ruthless aristocrat who had abandoned her, but a lost soul who had never learned that love required presence rather than protection through distance. The thaw came gradually, like the slow retreat of winter into spring, measured not in dramatic declarations, but in accumulated moments of tentative connection that built upon each other across the weeks that followed the storm's revelation. And Celeste found herself agreeing to morning rides across the estate grounds when her husband suggested them with careful diffidence, both of them mounted on horses side by side, as mist rose from the meadows and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. And during these rides, they spoke of simple things at first, observations about the land and the tenants and the slow preparation of the earth for planting, but gradually the conversations deepened into exchanges about books they had read and places they had traveled and memories from childhood spent in such different circumstances, and she discovered that he possessed a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments, a wry observation about the pretensions of society, or a self-deprecating comment about his own inadequacies that made her lips curve despite her lingering wariness. He began joining her for breakfast, a meal she had long taken alone in the morning room, and she noticed how he observed what she preferred, how jam appeared that matched her favorite flavors, and tea was prepared exactly to her taste without her needing to request it, small considerations that might have seemed trivial to others, but which she recognized as evidence of attention and care. His way of learning her through action when words still came with such difficulty, and she found herself softening incrementally with each thoughtful gesture, each sign that he was trying to know her not as the portrait he had studied or the idea he had constructed, but as the actual woman who sat across from him. Their evening meals lost some of their terrible tension as March arrived with its uncertain weather, alternating between winter's last gasps and spring's tentative promises, and Celeste began to share observations about her day without prompting, mentioning a letter from her sister or a concern about one of the housemaids whose mother had taken ill, and she watched him listen with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail. And when the maid's mother required a physician, he had already arranged for the estate doctor to attend her before Celeste could make the request herself, and the gesture touched something tender in her that her anger had not quite managed to calcify beyond all feeling. She observed him too during these weeks, watching when he did not know himself, watched as he dealt with the estate tenants who came to him with concerns, and she saw a patience and genuine care in his interactions that contradicted everything she had believed about his character, and saw him listen to a farmer's troubles about a sick cow with the same attention he might give to matters of far greater financial import, saw him adjust a rent when a family had suffered misfortune, and she began to understand that the cold duke who had abandoned her was only one facet of a far more complex man, that beneath the aristocratic reserve lay depths she had never been given the opportunity to explore, and the recognition filled her with a strange mixture of grief for what they had lost and cautious hope for what they might yet build. His attempts at closeness remained careful, almost fearful, as though he expected her to retreat at any moment back into the icy politeness that had characterized their first weeks together, and she saw in his hesitation both respect for her boundaries and a vulnerability that matched her own, for they were both wounded creatures attempting to trust again after betrayal, both uncertain whether the ground between them would hold their weight or collapse into the chasm that had separated them for so long. And in the slow accumulation of mornings and evenings and small kindnesses, Celeste felt the first real stirrings of possibility, the sense that perhaps they might yet salvage something genuine from the wreckage of their beginning. Celeste had not been able to sleep that night in late March when the moon was full and cast silver light across her chambers, her mind restless with thoughts of the man who was her husband, yet still felt like a careful stranger, and she had risen from her bed wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the lingering chill, and wandered through the quiet corridors of Ashford Estate, seeking the library where she so often found solace, not expecting to find the Duke already there, standing by the tall windows, looking out at the moonlit gardens, with such desolation in his posture that she nearly retreated before he turned and saw her, his expression shifting through surprise and something that looked almost like relief before settling into careful neutrality as he asked if he had disturbed her rest by his presence. She shook her head and admitted that sleep had eluded her, moving into the room with hesitant steps, and for a long moment they stood in the moon-washed darkness, neither speaking nor retreating, until he began to talk in a voice so raw it seemed torn from some deep wounded place, telling her that he could not sleep either for the self-loathing that plagued him whenever he closed his eyes, that he saw her face from their wedding night, waiting for a husband who never came, and the knowledge of what he had done to her ate at him like poison, that he had convinced himself his absence was noble, when in truth it had been cowardice, born of fear that he could never be enough for her, never inspire in her anything beyond duty and resigned tolerance. The words came faster then, as though a dam had broken. His admission that he had loved her from the moment he first saw her at a ball months before their betrothal, but had never believed someone like her could love someone like him, cold and inadequate and damaged by a childhood where affection was weakness and vulnerability was punished, and he had run rather than face the slow death of watching her realize she had been trapped with a man incapable of making her happy. And Celeste felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this confession, felt the rage she had carried for so long finally find its voice as she moved toward him with trembling hands and struck his chest with her fists, demanding to know how he could have been so cruel in his supposed kindness, how he could have left her to believe herself so worthless that her own husband could not bear to stay even one night, how he could have stolen from her the chance to choose whether she could love him by making that choice for her through his abandonment. He accepted her blows without defending himself, let her rage wash over him with tears now streaming down his own face, and when her fury finally exhausted itself into broken sobs, he opened his arms in tentative offering, and she collapsed against him, weeping for all the wasted months, and the pain they had both endured, and the fragile hope that perhaps they might yet find their way to each other. and he held her with a gentleness that belied his reputation for ruthlessness, one hand cradling her head against his chest while he whispered broken apologies into her hair, and gradually her tears subsided into shuddering breaths as she became aware of his heartbeat beneath her ear, racing as wildly as her own. And when she lifted her face to look at him, she saw in his eyes such naked longing and fear and desperate hope that something shifted irrevocably in her chest. They stood like that for a long time in the moonlight, and slowly, carefully, as though handling something infinitely precious and fragile, he reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining in a touch that felt more intimate than any embrace. And she understood in that moment that this was their true beginning, that everything before had been merely prologue to this instant, when two wounded souls chose to trust enough to try. And though the damage could not be undone and forgiveness would not come easily or quickly, they had taken the first real step toward building something genuine from the ruins of their false start. And in the acknowledgement of their mutual brokenness lay the foundation for possible healing. The months that followed that moonlit encounter transformed into what Celeste could only describe as a courtship within marriage, an intentional discovery of each other that should perhaps have preceded their vows, but which now felt all the more precious for being chosen rather than assumed. And as April blossomed into May with its explosion of flowers across the estate gardens, they began to build something genuine from the foundation of their shared vulnerability, finding in each other depths and compatibilities that might have remained forever hidden had they not been forced through such darkness to reach this light. She discovered that he loved music as she did, and that he would sit in the music room while she played pianoforte with an expression of such transported peace that it moved something tender in her chest. And one evening, he surprised her by joining her at the instrument and playing a duet with unexpected skill, their hands dancing across the keys in harmony while their eyes met and held. And in that moment of shared creation, she felt more intimately connected to him than she had thought possible. They began staying up late into the nights, talking in the library, where so much of their healing had occurred, discussing everything from philosophy to poetry to their differing perspectives on estate management, and she found that his mind was sharp and thoughtful in ways she had never been given opportunity to appreciate, that he listened to her opinions with genuine interest and sometimes altered his own views based on her reasoning, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than merely an ornamental wife. And the respect implicit in these exchanges fed something in her soul that had been starving. His dry humor emerged more frequently as he grew comfortable enough to lower his guard, wry observations about the absurdities of aristocratic society, or self-deprecating comments about his own failings that made her laugh with genuine delight. And she found herself seeking opportunities to provoke that subtle smile that transformed his normally austere features into something approaching boyish, and he in turn seemed to treasure each instance of her laughter as though it were a gift he had not dared hope to receive. They discovered a shared love of early mornings when mist still clung to the gardens and the world felt hushed and holy, and they began taking walks together through the dew-laden grounds, speaking of small things and large, comfortable sometimes in silence and other times talking with the ease of old friends. And during these walks, he would occasionally take her hand to help her over rough ground and then forget to release it, and she would let her fingers remain intertwined with his feeling, the warmth of his skin against hers, and the rightness of such simple contact. The physical attraction that had always simmered beneath the surface began to build naturally from their emotional connection. Charged glances held a moment too long across the dinner table, the brush of shoulders when they sat together reading, the way her breath would catch when he stood close enough that she could smell the sandalwood soap he favored, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too. This growing desire that was no longer merely physical, but rooted in genuine affection and deepening love. Yet he remained patient, never pushing beyond what she seemed ready to give, allowing her to set the pace of their physical reconciliation as he had allowed her to set the pace of their emotional one. By the time summer arrived in full glory, they had been transformed by patience and intentional care, both of them different people than they had been on that cold wedding night. And Celeste understood that sometimes the greatest loves are not the ones that begin perfectly, but rather the ones that are built deliberately from broken pieces. And in the building they had found not just reconciliation, but genuine partnership, not just forgiveness, but the foundation for lasting devotion. The grand ballroom of Viscount Pemberton's London estate blazed with 1,000 candles on that warm July evening when Celeste and the Duke made their first public appearance as a truly united couple, she radiant in emerald silk that brought out the depths of her eyes, and he resplendent in formal evening attire, but more transformed by the softness in his expression when he looked at his wife, and they had been circulating through the gathered aristocracy, accepting congratulations and enduring barely veiled curiosity about their reconciliation, when Celeste felt the Duke's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her arm, and she followed his gaze to see Lord Nathaniel Hartley entering the ballroom, looking much the same as she remembered, though perhaps with new lines around his eyes that spoke of his own journey through the intervening months. She felt her husband's tension radiating through the subtle contact between them, that instinctive jealousy of a man confronting the one who had offered comfort to his wife during her abandonment, and she turned to meet his eyes, seeing there both trust and vulnerability. As he struggled with emotions he was still learning to navigate, and she placed her gloved hand over his with gentle pressure and said quietly that Nathaniel had been a friend when she desperately needed one, but that her heart belonged entirely and irrevocably to her husband, and she watched as her words settled over him like balm, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though wariness remained in the set of his jaw. Lord Hartley approached them with the careful dignity of a man navigating difficult social terrain, bowing formally to them both and offering courteous congratulations on their evident happiness, and the Duke responded with stiff civility, while Celeste offered genuine warmth, tempered with appropriate distance. And after the requisite pleasantries, Lord Hartley asked if he might have a brief word with the Duchess, and though every instinct clearly screamed against it, the Duke looked to Celeste for guidance, and she nodded reassurance. And with visible effort, he excused himself to speak with a nearby acquaintance, while remaining close enough to observe. Nathaniel led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom near the terrace doors, where the music was less overwhelming, and for a moment they stood in silence, weighted with all that had passed between them, until he said with quiet sincerity that he was glad to see her so happy, and that the light had returned to her eyes in a way he had never seen during their friendship, and he knew it was because she had found with her husband what he had once hoped to offer her, and Celeste felt tears prick her eyes at his generosity as she thanked him for his kindness during the darkest period of her life, for seeing her worth when she had felt worthless, and for offering friendship without expectation of return. But she needed him to know that she had chosen her marriage, not from duty or lack of options, but because in fighting for it, she had discovered a love deeper and truer than she had imagined possible. He smiled then with genuine warmth unmarred by bitterness, and told her that he had known from the moment of their last conversation months ago that she would choose the Duke, that he had seen in her determination to understand her husband the seeds of what would become devotion, and while his own heart had needed time to heal, he found now that he could celebrate her happiness without reservation, that knowing she was loved as she deserved to be loved brought him a measure of peace, and he had recently met someone himself who showed promise of becoming important to him, and Celeste clasped his hands briefly in farewell, grateful for this closure that released them both from the ghost of what might have been. When she returned to her husband's side, he searched her face with anxious eyes, and she smiled at him with such open affection that his expression transformed into relief and something fiercer, and he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, where they moved together in perfect synchrony, and she knew that the past had finally been laid to rest, and the future stretched before them bright with promise and hard-won joy. They returned to Ashford Hall in the quiet hours of that August night, the carriage ride home from London, filled with charged silence, and the occasional meeting of eyes that spoke of desires, long deferred, and finally ready to be fulfilled, and when they entered the estate, it felt transformed from that cold monument to isolation it had once been into something alive with possibility. And the Duke dismissed the servants with unusual curtness, leaving him and Celeste alone in the entrance hall, where candlelight cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed so much sorrow and were now poised to witness healing. He turned to her with an expression that mingled vulnerability and want, asking with halting words if she would come to his chambers not from duty but from choice, and she answered by taking his hand and leading him up the grand staircase toward the east wing, where his apartments overlooked the gardens they had walked through so many mornings, discovering each other anew, and when they entered his rooms, she saw that he had prepared them carefully, fresh flowers on every surface and candles lit to create an atmosphere of tenderness rather than mere seduction, and her heart swelled at this evidence of his consideration and care. They stood facing each other in the flickering light, and she could see the tremor in his hands as he reached to cup her face, asking permission with his eyes before every touch, as though she was something precious and fragile that might shatter if handled carelessly. And she leaned into his palm, feeling the warmth of his skin against her cheek, and whispered that she trusted him completely, that she wanted this union not from obligation, but from genuine desire and love, hard-won through their journey, from darkness. And at her words, something in him seemed to break free, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made tears spring to her eyes, because it was so different from what she might have expected, that first terrible night, so full of reverence and restrained passion that spoke of his determination to treasure rather than simply take. She responded with equal fervor, her hands finding the planes of his chest and feeling his heart racing beneath her palms, and they undressed each other slowly with trembling fingers and whispered endearments, discovering the landscape of skin and vulnerability with the wonder of true intimacy rather than mere physical congress. And when he laid her on his bed, he paused to look at her with such naked adoration that she felt wholly seen and wholly accepted for the first time in her life. And she drew him down to her, whispering his given name which she had so rarely used, and their coming together was a meditation on healing and connection, every touch and kiss an act of love rather than conquest, every shared breath a prayer of gratitude for second chances and hard-won understanding. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, speaking in hushed tones about everything and nothing, and he told her that he loved her with a depth that terrified him in its intensity, that she had become the axis around which his entire world revolved, and she confessed that she had fallen in love with the man he truly was beneath the defensive walls he had built, from years of believing himself unworthy of genuine affection, and they both wept tears of joy and release, knowing that they had finally consummated not just their marriage, but the profound partnership they had built from the ashes of their disastrous beginning. And as dawn began to paint the sky with rose and gold, they made love again, with the easy intimacy of those who know themselves truly joined in body and soul and spirit, the transformation from abandonment to devotion finally complete in every way that mattered. 5 years had transformed Ashford Hall from that echoing monument to sorrow into something alive with joy and warmth. The spring afternoon, golden with sunshine that poured through windows thrown open to admit the scent of blooming roses and the sound of children's laughter from the gardens below. And Celeste stood at the nursery window, watching her 3 children at play in the maze, where she and their father had once walked in awkward silence, learning to trust each other. And now 7-year-old Edmund chased his younger sisters Catherine and Elizabeth through the hedgerows with the uninhibited delight of a child who had never known anything but love and security, their nurse following at a discreet distance, allowing them freedom within safe boundaries. She felt warm arms encircle her waist from behind and leaned back against her husband's chest with the easy intimacy of lovers who had earned their devotion through patience and pain, and he pressed a kiss to her temple, murmuring that he had escaped from the endless correspondence in his study to find her because an hour without her presence felt like deprivation, and she turned in his embrace to see the softness in his eyes that had replaced the cold wariness of their early days. The lines around his mouth now formed from laughter rather than bitterness, and she marveled, as she often did, at how completely they had transformed from those wounded strangers who could barely speak to each other into partners whose connection ran soul-deep and unshakable. They watched together as Edmund helped little Elizabeth to her feet after a tumble, displaying the gentle protectiveness his father had modeled for him, and Celeste reflected on how their children would grow up, surrounded by the evidence of genuine love, never doubting that their parents treasured each other and them, never experiencing the cold formality that had poisoned her husband's own childhood and nearly destroyed their marriage before it could truly begin. And she felt his hand move to rest on her slightly rounded belly, where their 4th child grew, and he said with wonder in his voice that he still could not believe the richness of the life they had built from such devastating beginnings, that he woke some mornings, afraid it was all a dream, and he would find himself back in that self-imposed exile, having never had the courage to return and fight for her. She assured him, as she had countless times, that this was real, that they were real, that every day of their marriage now was a testament to the power of choosing love over fear and pride, and they had proven that even the most broken beginning could be transformed through vulnerability and forgiveness and the courage to try again. And she kissed him with the easy affection of a woman wholly secure in her husband's devotion, and together they descended to the gardens to join their children, and the sound of the Duke's deep laughter mingling with Celeste's lighter tones, and the delighted shrieks of their offspring echoed through the halls that had once known only silence and sorrow, and Ashford Hall stood warm in the afternoon sun, a living monument to redemption and the triumph of love over abandonment. Every room filled now with the evidence that darkness need not be permanent, and that patience and understanding could heal even the deepest of wounds. And as Celeste watched her husband swing their daughters into the air, while Edmund clung to his leg demanding attention, she knew with absolute certainty that their journey from that terrible wedding night to this moment of complete happiness had been worth every tear and every moment of doubt, because they had built something true and lasting from the ashes of their mistakes. That evening, after the children had been settled into their beds with kisses and whispered stories, Celeste and the Duke walked together through the gardens, where so much of their healing had taken place, the late spring air fragrant with jasmine and roses that climbed the ancient stone walls, and they paused at the bench where they had once sat in painful silence during those early days of tentative reconciliation. And now they sat again, but their bodies curved naturally together in the easy intimacy of lovers, who had earned every moment of their happiness through patience and courage. And he took her hand in his and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, saying that he still marveled at how completely their story had transformed from that terrible beginning into this profound joy. And she leaned her head against his shoulder, reflecting that their journey had taught her that beginnings, no matter how devastating, need not determine endings. If people chose vulnerability over pride and forgiveness over bitterness, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, knowing that they had built something true and lasting from the wreckage of their mistakes. Dear listener, perhaps you have known the pain of abandonment or the devastation of dreams shattered before they could properly form. Perhaps you have stood in the ruins of what should have been beautiful and wondered if healing was even possible. And this story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford stands as testament that darkness is not permanent, and that patience, coupled with the courage to be vulnerable, can transform even the deepest wounds into unexpected wholeness, for they proved that love is not found in perfect beginnings, but rather in the choice to keep trying when every instinct screams to protect oneself and retreat. And their transformation from wounded strangers who could barely speak to devoted partners, whose connection ran soul deep, teaches us that we must not judge a relationship by its starting point, but rather by what two people choose to build when given the chance. And sometimes the greatest love stories are not those that begin with passion and ease, but those that are forged in the fires of misunderstanding and pain, and emerge stronger for having survived the testing. May you find the courage to be vulnerable, even when fear whispers that walls are safer than openness. May you discover that patience is not passive acceptance, but rather active choice to believe in possibility, even when evidence suggests otherwise. May you learn as Celeste and her Duke learned that genuine intimacy requires the terrifying courage to be truly seen with all your flaws and wounds and fears laid bare. And may you know that no beginning is so dark that it cannot be transformed by two hearts willing to choose love over pride and understanding over judgment. And in your own relationships, whether just beginning or long established, may you remember that connection is built not in grand gestures, but in accumulated small moments of kindness and consideration, and the daily choice to see and treasure the person before you. And may you rest tonight in the peace of knowing that redemption is always possible, and that love earned through struggle is love that endures. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear that broken beginnings can become beautiful endings. And may you sleep well, knowing that tomorrow offers another chance to choose vulnerability and courage and love.